Loren, welcome to the show. This is kind of a different podcast for me because I invited you because I like your stuff so much. And the audience doesn't know probably about it, maybe not. 21hats.com, you do a newsletter every day. And why don't you describe that newsletter and then we'll kind of talk about it. And I'm sure we're just going to roll. You're going to be an interesting conversation for the audience.
David, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And thank you for your interest in what I'm doing. Happy to tell you my newsletter. It's a daily email newsletter called the 21 Hats Morning Report. And it's got a little bit of the content that we're creating at 21 Hats, but it's really an aggregation newsletter. I try to scour the web for the most important stories for business owners on any given day and put it all together in one place so business owners don't have to go looking for what's most important to them. So, in recent weeks, there's been a lot of stuff about PPP and the changing rules and that kind of stuff. Also, with all the legislation that's gone through, there are a lot of tax credits that people might miss. So I've tried to highlight what any business owner would want to know. That's really the heart of what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I've read your 21 Hats newsletter for months. Okay, and
Thank
then
you.
you threw a zinger in this week with the cinnamon covered fish tails or whatever. That what was it? Or shrimp tails? What was that thing?
Shrimp tails in breakfast cereal. Yes. That thing blew up on Twitter. It was a story about General Mills is the producer of the cereal, and I don't cover big corporations unless I think there's a lesson for business owners in it. And when something like this happens, first of all, there's a certain amount of entertainment value, which you obviously appreciate. But second of all, I think there's a good lesson in it. I mean, they handled the customer complaint terribly, and it just kept getting worse for them. And it would have been so easy for them to handle it better and just say, oh my gosh, we don't know what happened, but we're going to find out, and we apologize, and here's a free box of cereal or whatever.
Yeah. So tell the audience, I mean, you have a very impressive background with some of the media publications that you've worked for, but can you go back to the beginning in that you were part of, what was the magazine called? George Magazine?
It was.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in that. That was a very, just that situation. And then when Kennedy died and what type of guy was he? I mean, I never knew anything about him.
Let me stop you there. I never met John Kennedy. He was the founder of George Magazine. I only got a job there, sadly, because he died.
Yeah,
it's a sad story in many ways. George was started by John Kennedy in the 90s with the goal of being a bipartisan political publication. And he largely, despite being the son of a Democratic president, he largely pulled it off. It was perceived as bipartisan. Unfortunately, some people perceive bipartisan as being boring, and that's not a good thing for a magazine.
How can it be boring? I mean, could you even do bipartisan today? I mean, in today's
I don't think
climate?
It would work today. It feels like something that should have occurred in the 1890s, not the 1990s. But he made a really good faith effort at trying to make this work and trying to rise above the partisanship that even then, I mean, it's nowhere near where it is today, but even then, everybody knew what was an issue. Sadly, he died. And this is, kind of a ridiculous story. It's how corporations work. But Hachette Philippaki, a French corporation, was the publisher of the magazine. After he died, they put his picture on a cover, and it sold out on newsstands in about 20 seconds. And they looked at that and said, we've been struggling, but maybe there is a magazine here. Let's give it another year. And they hired a new editor, and that new editor hired me as his number two. And we spent the year 2000 trying to breathe life into a model that really wasn't working. And it was a great year for me. It was, the year of the 2000 election was a great year to be covering politics. I had a lot of fun. The conventions were amazing. It was an amazing, it's funny, you think of this, back in 2000, the first cover I was involved in was a cover of Donald Trump, who was thinking of running for president, or at least talking about running for president back then. And we didn't take it particularly seriously, but we got a fun, lighthearted story about it, not realizing where things would ultimately go. But we spent the year, advertising disappeared throughout the year, and that left us with a ton of pages to fill. I've never worked so hard in my life. We moved so much copy trying to fill those pages. It was a great year, though. I learned so much and had a great experience.
And then talk about now, you've worked for Forbes, and what are some of the other magazines you've worked for also?
Well, the big move was I worked at mostly general interest publications. And then in 2002, I went to Inc. magazine, which was really my introduction to entrepreneurship. I had an undergraduate degree in business. I knew something about business, I thought, but I really didn't know entrepreneurship. I like a lot of journalists out there, I hate to say it, they hear the phrase small business and all they really hear is small. And, we understood that small business is important in the aggregate, but we didn't understand, I didn't understand what it took to build a business. And then I got to Inc. and started meeting a lot of really interesting people. Some of them, people who'd been at Inc. for many years and had drunk the Kool-Aid and knew all about entrepreneurship. And then, of course, the entrepreneurs who passed through the magazine and who I got to know. And it was an amazing education, and I fell in love with it. And that was really the changing, turning point in my career.
And then from there, where did you go?
I was there about 5 or 6 years, and then went to the New York Times, where they had approached me and asked me to basically recreate their version of Inc. magazine as a web vertical at the Times. And this was in the spring of 2008. And they approached me and I said, you know what? I have a lot of friends at Inc. I owe them a lot. I wouldn't know anything about entrepreneurship without them. I can't see going to another publication and creating competition for them. It just doesn't feel right. And then about 2 weeks after Lehman Brothers fell, I was laid off along with the entire digital division at Inc. magazine. Long story, but we had a bunch of projects that just were not working. It was a reasonable decision to just lay everybody off and start over. I was the editor of the website. It was painful at the time, but I understood why it happened. And then I called up the New York Times and said, by the way, if you're still looking, I might consider, do you want to talk? Yeah. And luckily for me, they did. And I wound up taking that job that I had turned down and spending a great 5 or 6 years there, kind of creating that competition for Inc. magazine, at least in my mind. And then I left the Times and went to Forbes to do something similar. In each case, I felt, although obviously I didn't leave Inc. voluntarily, but I felt as though I had a vision for a platform, for a community of business owners that I couldn't quite convince my colleagues to buy into. At the Times, it didn't happen because I was too small a part of what they were doing. They didn't have, I wasn't a priority. There wasn't enough interest. But I had this vision that I, had in mind, and I kept trying to go somewhere else to see if I could get them to fully implement it. And we never quite got there at any of those big media companies, unfortunately.
Oh, too bad. I would have expected something maybe a little bit different with Forbes, because they push a lot on entrepreneurism, and
that's why I went
seem
there.
To be somewhat creative. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think their view, there's nothing wrong with this. I should hasten to point out. But their view of entrepreneurship is to focus primarily on venture-backed, world-changing entrepreneurship.
Okay.
They're less interested in, traditional small businesses, what it takes to build, a bootstrap business where you don't have millions of dollars of venture funding.
Now, going back to this Inc. magazine or any of these things here, Inc., New York Times, Forbes, whatever, were you ever in the position where you got to go on site and kind of do that, kind of shadow somebody?
Sure.
And kind of really experience what it was like? And were there some aha moments when you did that?
Oh, absolutely. It was really eye-opening. I think the first experience I had, well, I'll give you two. First of all, I was doing a focus group while I was at Inc., where we were talking to business owners about what they were looking for from a business publication. And, were we giving them information that was useful? Were we giving them what they needed? So we had a table full of, 15 to 20 business owners having a really good conversation. But there was one guy in particular who just didn't seem to be having it. And I wasn't sure what it was. And I said to him, I tried to draw him out a little bit. And I said, what are you looking for? What could we give you that would be helpful to you? And he just looked at me and said, well, I'll tell you what I don't want. I don't want to be told how to run my business by some 23-year-old kid working at a money-losing publication. And to me, it sounds completely obvious, and it should have been obvious, but it was really an eye-opening moment, because I think that is the flaw in a lot of journalism that gets aimed at business owners. The idea that some young journalist could talk to three people and then write something up that tells a business owner how to run his or her business. It's insane when you say it that way, but people are doing that all the time.
Yeah, and that's like the person who's married 6 months and writes a blog on how to have a successful marriage.
Exactly. So I really took that to heart. And ever since then, talk about it, an eye-opening moment. Ever since then, I have tried my best to never tell anyone how to run their business, to remember that one size doesn't fit all. What works for one person is not necessarily going to work for someone else. And that's why I hate, it's so easy to find articles like 6 ways to improve your SEO tomorrow, or, 10 businesses you can start in your pajamas. It's hard to take that seriously. It's easy to laugh about it, but there's a lot of that out there that people think that's what they should be doing. My feeling is what you really need to do is hear directly from the business owners and tell their story, but not tell it in a way as if everybody should do the same thing. Tell it in a way where you don't just celebrate the successes, you track the whole journey. You see, what was the challenge? What was the problem? What did they try to do to solve that problem? What didn't work? What didn't work? What didn't work? Then finally, what did work? And you can learn as much from what went wrong as you do from what went right. And if you tell that whole story, anybody reading it can pick up something in there that's valuable. But if you just say, do this or do that, it's not the same thing. So that was a really important lesson for me.
That's a biggie. Now, is 21 Hats kind of the evolution of this vision that you've had for, it sounds like 10 plus years?
It is. I'll tell you, there's one other person I met. You asked about going on site and talking to practitioners and figuring things out. There was one guy who came into Inc. magazine. He had been profiled by our star writer, Bo Burlingham. I edited the story. It was a story that was done as a treatment of Bo's book, which is called Small Giants. And it's about companies that are more focused on being great than on being big. And that, growth is overhyped, but they're when you run a business, there can be more important things than just growing as fast as you can, and bit more ways to be successful than just trying to do that. And he chose Jay Goltz, who has the largest picture framing shop. So it's big for that industry, but it's in a very small industry. It's a picture framing business in Chicago. He also has a home and garden store. Jay was kind of emblematic of what Bo was writing about, because he had big eyes at one time, and he had tried to sort of do a marketing ploy that would roll up picture framing shops all over the country and create a one-stop shop where you could go and find the best framer in your town. And he lost a ton of money doing it and realized, you know what, that's not me. I don't need to do that. I don't have to, compete with the venture-backed companies. I can make enough money and have enough excitement in my life running my businesses here in Chicago. And, they're sizable businesses. I don't think he'd mind my saying, he's got a $20 million business with all of his businesses together. So it's not, it's not huge. It's a small business, but it's not a mom and pop shop either. Yeah. So Jay comes into the office, and I'd never heard anybody talk to him. He just kind of let out what it takes to build a business. And the one thing that really stuck out to me, he talked about, what he'd had to do to borrow money through the years. And I, like a lot of business journalists, never realized that it was completely commonplace for business owners to put their homes up as collateral to get a loan. Business owners know this. They take it for granted. Some won't do it, but those who do figure this is the cost of doing business. If you want to borrow money in this country, that's what you have to do. Journalists, by and large, don't realize that. And it really opened my eyes and made me realize that a lot of my colleagues who I'd worked with, some of the smartest business journalists in America, just had no idea what they were missing. They thought that it was people on Wall Street and people in Silicon Valley who were taking big risks and doing interesting things, but they were taking risks with other people's money. People like Jay Goltz are taking risks with their own money, putting it all on the line, trying to build something and creating, career paths for hundreds of people, sometimes each of them. So that really had an impact on me. To me, that was realizing the creativity and the nerve and all the great things.
The commitment.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're all in. It's something that a lot of people in high school and college don't realize, and even coming out of college with the current entitlement mentality, where they just feel they should get it, or it shouldn't, it's not that hard. They just don't get it, Money doesn't, the old saying, money doesn't grow on trees. I don't think you hear that saying very often nowadays.
That's part of it. And to the extent people are aware of what entrepreneurs do, and we in the media are way too responsible for this. The focus is so often on people who've had big success, which makes it kind of sound easy, like anybody could do it. And it's not that hard. And the truth is, some of those people who have big success are venture backed. They're playing with other people's money. And the venture capitalists want a big score. So they're just throwing money at them and telling them, you got to spend all this money, because if you don't, it's not going to be a big enough success to make a difference for us. We'd rather have you fail than have a middling successful business. That's not part of their game. It's either go big or go home. And to me, that's the real shame that people don't realize about venture capital. A lot of business ideas that could be really good businesses get blown out of the water because they just aren't quite successful enough.
Yeah. And don't you have Jay on some of your podcasts?
Yes, I do a weekly podcast. Jay went with me to the New York Times. He was a regular contributor on a small business blog that I started there. He's really helped me understand what the entrepreneurial journey can be like. He's on the 21 Hats podcast. It's a weekly podcast. I talk to the same 6 or 7 owners every week. I talk to 3 of 6 or 7 regulars, and we've been doing this since before the crisis. So it's really been interesting, because when I started out doing it before the crisis, I didn't know how long it would work to talk to the same owners every week. Would people get bored with their stories? Would enough things happen? But once the pandemic hit, their stories got very dramatic. I mean, some of them, it was an open question whether they were going to make it or not. And Jay will be the first to tell you, without the PPP money, his sizable, successful business that's been around 40 years might not have made it. There's a very good chance without the PP money that he would not have made it. And a couple others have really struggled. A couple have done better than they would have without the pandemic, which happens too, of course. But it's been, Jay's been great because he's got so much experience. And as he likes to say, he's made every mistake you can make and learn from it. That's the only way he learned.
That's the key.
And he remembers every mistake. So in talking through what the other owners on the podcast have gone through, he usually has, he doesn't tell anybody how to run their business either, but he usually can point to a lesson he's learned that's relevant to whatever someone's going through.
Yeah. Dr. Henry Cloud wrote a book years ago. I can't remember the name of the book at this moment, but he'd done a lot of work. He's not only a psychiatrist, but he'd done a lot of work with business owners. And he said in his study, the difference between a successful business owner and an unsuccessful one is the successful one makes a mistake and doesn't repeat it. Because like Jay,
that's right,
remembers it. Yeah. So now you've studied entrepreneurs, but now you're an entrepreneur with 21 hats, right?
I am, somewhat unexpectedly. I left Forbes in September of 2018. Because as I said, I hadn't been able to convince any of these big media companies to back the vision that I had for a real community of business owners. And, nobody ever said it was a bad idea. They always said, we've got these 6 other things we got to do first, and then we'll get back to you. And of course, they never got back to me. And eventually I figured out that they never were going to get back to me. And not because they were stupid people. They were, very smart people. It probably wasn't right for what I actually think it might have been right, but but it may not have been right for their business. And it was a small part of what they did. I left on very good terms, and I don't blame anybody for not doing it. But this thing was inside of me, and I wanted a chance to get it out. And I wound up leaving to partner with a really interesting guy named Adam Whitty, who founded a business called Advantage Forbes Books that's based in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a book publishing business, not the traditional book publishing model. People go to him and pay him to get a book ghostwritten and edited and published and marketed and to put them on a speaker tour. And he built a really successful, sizable business over 10 plus years doing that, and then started acquiring other businesses that, like the book publishing business, focus primarily on serving entrepreneurs. And he was at a point where he wanted to create a platform to bring together all the customers of his different businesses in one place and see if they could share information and expose them to his various offerings. And I convinced them, well, instead of spending X dollars to do that, spend 2X and let's be ambitious and don't build a platform just for your existing customers. Let's try to build the platform for business owners. And he bought it.
Okay. So you're doing 21 hats, and explain to the audience, publishing in many ways, it's been a tough road last 20 years.
It's been very tough. If I had known where it was going, I might have found something else to do. Although I do love what I do. So I don't know. Big media companies have really struggled going back to the arrival of the internet. That was a challenge that established companies just really struggled with. For a long time, the places that I worked at looked at the internet as something that they kind of wished would go away and didn't know how to make use of. So, a magazine like Inc. would just take its, the monthly magazine and dump it on the internet and think that was a website. And
no, I remember PC Magazine and PC World when it was like almost an inch thick. I mean, so many ads and so many articles.
Oh, sure. Oh, Fast Company, which was owned by the same people who owned Inc. magazine at the end when I worked for them. They were publishing 500 pages a month. It was, it was ridiculous. But that wasn't going to last. And everything kept moving to the internet. Some companies saw it sooner than others. The New York Times actually was in many ways ahead of the game in the sense that they were the first publication, certainly the first one I worked for, to decide, you know what, the stuff we publish on the internet is just as important as what we publish in print. Our standards are going to be the same. And, ultimately they started breaking big stories just on the internet. They didn't hold the story for print. And that was a really big deal when they started doing that.
So talk to me about how you're living out this vision. I mean, this publishing world's been turned upside down, obviously. A lot of changes. We could talk about that. But I think really from an audience perspective, what are you doing in your vision that's different? How are you pivoting this publishing model so that it's going to be appealing to your audience as something that really helps them grow, helps them profit more, get better, whatever?
Sure. Well, like a lot of us in the media business, I didn't know what to make of the internet for a long time. It scared the hell out of me. And then I went to the Times and really had to embrace it there. And I learned some important lessons. And the most important one was this. I started the small business blog that I told you about. And what I quickly realized was that no matter how good the stories we published on this blog were, the most important part of the blog was the conversations we started in the comments section. If we hit a nerve, if we did a good story, our loyal following of business owners would weigh in afterward with questions, suggestions, comments. They'd start conversations with each other. And I realized, there's only so many people you can interview for a story. We couldn't do all the report. You could take a year to report a simple story about one business if you wanted to. Just the economics of that don't work. But if you publish that story about the business and smart people weigh in with their thoughts and start picking it apart, how about this? How about that? You can create something really special. And that's what we did there. And that was the first big internet lesson that I learned. And that's been the heart of what I've wanted to do with this, community idea and what I'm trying to do on 21 Hats. Trying to think of the content that we create as just the starting point, but the community, the conversation, the engagement with our readers as the heart and soul of, what I want to build. So to me, that's the key right there.
That's very interesting you say that, because I read recently somebody talking about, I think they were talking, it was actually Brandon Gale who talks about how to millionaire blogging. And he was talking about that you have to make yourself available when you blog. So you can't just let people make comments and not respond. You need to engage. And you're validating that.
That's exactly right. And that was a big part of my issue at Forbes. Again, that's a great publication. They're doing wonderful. I'm sure they don't miss me. They're going to be just fine. But they made a very reasonable decision to turn off all comments there. And it was reasonable because, as you know, there's a lot of insanity on the internet. And at a publication like that has the reach that they do, you get a lot of nut jobs who, take up all of the comments section, and it loses value. And it requires incredible manpower to review those comments and weed out the stuff that just doesn't belong there. And they made the reasonable decision that it's just not worth the investment for us to do that. But that eliminates what you just, the issue you just raised, which is the back and forth, the opportunity to build that relationship with your reader. They gave up on that. That's the most important part of it to me. And that's what I'm trying to do at 21 Hats.
Interesting. So if people want to learn more about 21 Hats, what you're doing, listen to the podcast, where do they go? What's the best way to engage?
They can go to 21hats.com. And that's with the number 2, the number 1, hats.com. And the first thing they'll see in the top right of the page is a place to subscribe to the daily email, which again looks to put forward to aggregate the most important stories of the day for business owners. One day a week, I try to ask a provocative question on Saturdays and see what kind of responses we get. So, one week I asked entrepreneurs to tell us, how much information do you share with your spouse? Which is, some people share everything, some people share nothing. And we got an interesting range of comments on that. This past Saturday, I asked, do you ever feel guilty about paying yourself more than you do your employees? And again, got an interesting range of comments from, what are you kidding me? No, never. To, that's a serious issue. I worry about that a lot. So again, I'm looking for that engagement. But back to your question, if they go to 21hats.com, they can subscribe to the newsletter if they want. They'll find all the old podcasts there. We started doing that before the pandemic, and we're doing it every week since then. And we just recorded one today, in fact, where Jay Galtz is talking about, he calls himself a recovering entrepreneuraholic. And every 6 months, he has a new idea that he gets all hyped up about that he's got to do. A couple of years ago, he bought a firehouse of all things. He was thinking it might be a great dog kennel. Was on the way to the airport. And he wound up just selling it. And Jay being Jay, I think he made money on the sale, but it wasn't the business that he was excited about. And then he tells me, I'm never doing it again. I'm done. Well, this week he told me, I've got a new idea. And he's starting a new business, and that'll be in the podcast that we publish on Tuesday.
Well, does that kind of lead into an explanation of the 21 Hats name? Why did you come up with 21 Hats?
Well, obviously, as I'm sure you realize, the hat idea is we wanted to show respect. You do have to wear a lot of hats to build a business. There's nothing magical about the number 21. Truth to tell, I like the sound of it. I think it's in the ballpark of the number of hats an entrepreneur has to wear, but it didn't have to be 21. It helped that the domain name was available, and I took that 10 years ago, actually, along with Jay. But the other thing that went into the decision was I didn't want the name to have the phrase "small business" in it, because some people are actually offended by that phrase. They find it demeaning, and I didn't want to limit our audience. I mean, one of those hats is, the best ways to hire people. And I think anybody who's a manager at a large corporation, a founder at a Silicon Valley company, a mom and pop deli, everybody has to think about the right process to hire people. And if you have a good strategy for how to check references, that could be valuable to anybody. I wanted a name that would allow anybody to feel comfortable there and not like they're at the wrong place. So that's what we were going for with 21 Hats.
Awesome, Loren. Well, 21hats.com. Check it out. Loren, thank you for being on the show. This has been fun. I'm just getting started. I feel like we could talk for another 4 hours, but we don't have the format for that, or the studio time today. Maybe we'll have to do this again.
I would love to. This has been great. Thank you so much for your interest, David. I really appreciate it.